The neon sign of the Velvet Grill flickered against the relentless Chicago rain, casting long, jagged shadows across the wet pavement of Michigan Avenue. Inside, the atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the biting wind outside. The air was thick with the scent of aged wagyu, expensive truffles, and the suffocating perfume of the city's elite. Sarah Thompson, a 24-year-old waitress whose weary eyes told the story of 3 consecutive double shifts, adjusted her apron for the 100th time that evening. Her feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, but she kept a practiced smile plastered on her face, knowing that every cent of her tips was already spoken for. Her younger brother, Jacob Walker, was struggling with a rare respiratory condition, and the mounting bills from the pediatric clinic were a constant weight on her chest. Sarah moved through the sea of mahogany tables and crystal glassware like a ghost, serving people who rarely looked her in the eye. At the center of the room sat Mark Anderson, the 38-year-old titan of the Anderson real estate empire, a man known as much for his ruthless business tactics as for his impeccable tailored suits. He was deep in a tense negotiation with investors, his voice a low, commanding hum that seemed to dictate the very temperature of the room. The night followed its usual pattern of high-stakes tension until the heavy brass doors creaked open, admitting a blast of cold air and an unexpected visitor. Standing in the foyer was a man who looked like he had just walked out of a war zone. He was roughly 55 years old, his face streaked with soot and his heavy canvas jacket singed at the edges. His boots were caked with drying mud and ash, leaving dark imprints on the pristine white marble floor. This was David Miller, a veteran firefighter who had spent the last 14 hours battling a 4-alarm warehouse blaze on the south side. He looked exhausted to the point of collapse, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a worn leather wallet. David wasn't looking for a 5-course meal. He was looking for his daughter, who had messaged him that she was working a late shift nearby. But his phone had died in the heat of the fire, and he was disoriented and dehydrated. Before he could even speak, the restaurant's floor manager, a man named Jeffrey Lewis, intercepted him with the speed of a predator. Jeffrey, dressed in a sharp silver vest that seemed to vibrate with his own self-importance, didn't see a hero. He saw a blemish on his perfect canvas. He stepped into David's path, his nose wrinkling in visible disgust at the faint smell of smoke that clung to the man-esque clothes. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately," Jeffrey hissed, his voice pitched low but sharp enough to cut through the ambient jazz. David blinked, his eyes bloodshot and weary. David started, but Jeffrey cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This is a private establishment, not a shelter or a rest stop for city workers. You are disturbing the comfort of our guests." At a nearby table, a group of young influencers snickered, one of them aiming a phone camera at the soot-covered man as if he were a circus attraction. Sarah, standing a few feet away with a tray of empty wine glasses, felt a hot surge of indignation rise in her throat. She recognized that looked the hollowed-out exhaustion of someone who had given everything to their job. Her own father had been a paramedic, and she knew that suit wasn't filth. It was the mark of a protector. She watched as David's shoulders slumped, the weight of the day finally crushing his spirit. He turned to leave, his movements heavy and sluggish, but he stumbled, his knee hitting the edge of a decorative pedestal. Jeffrey didn't reach out to help. Instead, he stepped back to protect his suit. "Security is on their way," Jeffrey announced loudly. Ensuring the nearby VIPs heard his decisiveness, David steadied himself, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red under the layers of ash. "I'm sorry," David whispered, his voice cracking. Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. She set her tray down on a side table with a decisive clatter that drew Mark Anderson's attention from across the room. She walked past Jeffrey, ignoring his frantic, silent signals to get back to the kitchen, and reached for David's arm. "Sir, please, come sit over here in the corner for a second," she said, her voice a warm anchor in the cold room. She guided him to a small, unoccupied bistro chair near the coat check, far from the prying eyes of the main floor, but still within Jeffrey's line of sight. Jeffrey marched over, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "Sarah Thompson, what do you think you're doing? I told this man to leave." Sarah looked Jeffrey dead in the eye, a fire in her gaze that he had never seen before. "He isn't a vagrant, Jeffrey. He's a firefighter. Look at his gear." She turned back to David, who was breathing heavily. "I'll get you some water, sir." Sarah ran to the service station, filling a tall glass with ice and filtered water. When she returned, Jeffrey blocked her path. "If you give him that glass, you're paying for the premium bottled water rate, plus a service fee for the special attention." Sarah didn't hesitate. She reached into her apron and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill to only tip she had made so far that night. Money she had intended to use for Jacob's inhaler refill. She slammed it onto the service counter. Take it. She pushed past the stunned manager and handed the water to David. He drank it greedily, the cool liquid bringing a spark of life back to his eyes. Thank you, honey, David rasped, looking up at her. Sarah sonella sadly. It's no trouble at all, but you need to get home and rest. David checked his wallet, his face falling. I was going to call a cab, but I think I lost my cash in the scramble at the warehouse. Sarah looked at the $20 bill Jeffrey was still holding with a smug grin. She knew she couldn't get that back. She reached deeper into her pocket and found her emergency Stacia $50 bill she kept tucked away for the absolute worst-case scenarios. It was her rent or food money. She walked David toward the door, shielding him from the glares of the staff. Outside, the rain was turning into a torrential downpour. She whistled for a yellow cab idling at the curb. As the taxi pulled up, she pressed the $50 bill into David's hand. This will get you anywhere in the city and give you enough for a warm meal, she told him. David tried to refuse. His eyes Ouija. Sarah closed his fingers over the money. Please. My dad would have wanted me to do this. As the taxi pulled away, Sarah stood on the sidewalk, the rain soaking through her thin uniform, her pockets now completely empty. She took a deep breath, braced herself, and walked back into the lion's den. Inside, Mark Anderson had stopped talking. He was watching the door, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the young waitress who had just given away her entire night's earnings to a stranger. Sarah stepped back inside the velvet grill, the heavy brass door, sealing out the rain, but trapping her in a different kind of storm. Water dripped from her hair onto her uniform, turning the expensive fabric darker and causing it to cling uncomfortably to her skin. She felt stripped bare, exposed not just by the cold, but by the totality of her actions. That $50 bill was meant for Jacob Walker's albuterol inhaler, the one that was running dangerously low. The reality of what she had just done crashed down on her with physical force. She had chosen a stranger. S, immediate comfort over her own brother. S, medical security. It was an agonizing calculation that twisted in her gut, a gamble on karma that felt terrifyingly reckless now that her pockets were empty. Jeffrey Lewis was waiting for her right by the entrance. His arms crossed, his silver vest gleaming under the foyer lights like polished armor. His expression wasn't just angry, it was triumphant. He had been waiting for an excuse to get rid of her, finding her empathy inconvenient in a place that valued exclusivity above all else. Look at yourself, Jeffrey sneered, his voice a quiet hiss meant only for her, though several nearby diners glanced over, sensing blood in the water. Dripping wet, smelling like the street, you are a disgrace to this establishment, Thompson. You think you're some kind of martyr? He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his expensive cologne cloying and suffocating. You disregarded a direct order from management to cater to a trust. That's insubordination. And that $20 you slapped on the counter? Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. He wasn't a vagrant, Jeffrey. He was a first responder who needed help. And I paid for the water. Jeffrey laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. Your job is to curate an experience for people who matter, not run a soup kitchen. You're finished here, Sarah Thompson. Turn in your apron at the end of the night. He spun on his heel, snapping his fingers at a busboy to mop up the few drops of rain Sarah had shed, treating her presence like a spill that needed containment. Sarah stood frozen, the finality of his words sinking in. Fired, docked pay. The image of Jacob's small face, wheezing in the middle of the night, flashed before her eyes, and she felt a wave of nausea so intense she almost grabbed a chair for support. She couldn't leave yet. She had to finish the shift, enduring the humiliation of serving tables, knowing it was all for nothing, forced to perform under the crushing weight of immediate financial ruin. Across the room, Mark Anderson had watched the entire exchange, his negotiation forgotten. The paperwork for the multi-million-dollar downtown acquisition lay ignored on the table. He was a man who dealt in concrete facts, in profit margins and risk assessments, yet what he had just witnessed defied his usual calculations. He had seen people throw money around in this restaurant every night, men buying $5 bottles of wine to impress a date, women dropping fortunes on handbags just to leave them on the floor. But he had never seen anyone give away what was clearly their last dollar to someone who could offer them absolutely nothing in return. That young waitress, Sarah, wore her exhaustion like a heavy coat. Yet she had stripped herself of her own safety net for a man covered in soot. It irritated Mark. It was illogical. It smacked of a naive sentimentality that he had long ago purged from his own life in his climb to the top. Yet, he could unlook away from the stiff set of her shoulders as she walked back towards the kitchen, defeated but strangely unbroken. His phone buzzed violently on the mahogany table, vibrating against the base of his untouched Scotch glass. It was his personal line, a number few people had. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was his younger sister, Elizabeth Jones, calling at an hour she knew he was usually working. He answered. His voice clipped. "Elizabeth, I'm in the middle of She cut him off, her voice frantic, breathless, bordering on hysteria. "Mark, have you heard? The warehouse district fire? It's the main Anderson logistics hub on 35th Street. It's gone." Mark felt a cold spike of adrenaline. That warehouse was the central nervous system of his shipping operations. Its loss was a catastrophe in the 8-figure range. "Calm down, Elizabeth. Is everyone out?" Elizabeth was sobbing now. "Forget the building, Mark. It's David Miller." He's not answering his phone. He was on shift today. The name hit Mark like a physical blow. David, Elizabeth's father-in-law. The quiet, sturdy man who always felt uncomfortable at Mark's lavish holiday parties. The man who had served the city for 30 years without complaint. The connection snapped into place with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. The suit, the exhaustion, the specific type of heavy canvas jacket. The man in the foyer hadn't just been any firefighter. He had been the man fighting to save Mark's own empire. The father of his sister's husband. Mark looked towards the door where the man had exited into the rain. A profound, unfamiliar sense of shame washing over him. He, Mark Anderson, the man who could buy and sell this entire city block, had sat sipping 50-year-old scotch while the man protecting his livelihood was treated like garbage feet away from him. And the only person who had recognized the humanity beneath the ash was a waitress whom Jeffrey was currently crucifying. Near the kitchen doors, the irony was bitter and sickening. He watched Jeffrey berating Sarah again, pointing a manicured finger in her face, likely twisting the knife over her termination. The sight of the manager's smug cruelty contrasted with the raw, selfless desperation he had seen in Sarah's eyes when she handed over that $50 bill, ignited a fury in Mark that had nothing to do with business. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, startling his dinner companions. He didn't bother excusing himself. He buttoned his suit jacket with icy precision and started walking toward the kitchen, his eyes fixed on Jeffrey like a hawk zeroing in on a field mouse. The room seemed to shrink around him, the ambient noise fading into a dull buzz. He wasn't just a businessman making a deal anymore. He was a man who had just realized the debt was owed, and Mark Anderson always paid his debts. Whatever storms you are facing in your own life right now, remember that kindness is a currency that never depreciates, even when it costs you everything you have in your pocket. If you're finding value in this story of resilience and unexpected connections, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't want to miss the final part of Sarah Thompson S. journey. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried the distinct, heavy resonance of a gavel striking a judge's bench. The two men turned to see Mark Anderson standing just outside the swinging kitchen doors, his imposing silhouette framed by the ambient light of the dining room. The entire kitchen staff, who had been pretending to scrub counters while eavesdropping on Sarah's termination, froze in place. Jeffrey Lewis, however, mistook the interruption for support. He straightened his silver vest, a fresh wave of obsequious confidence washing over his features. "Mr. Anderson, my apologies for the disturbance," Jeffrey said, his voice dripping with forced charm as he gestured dismissively towards Sarah, who was wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I was just handling a personnel issue." This waitress displayed a gross lack of judgment, letting riffraff wander through the dining room and disturb the ambience. Jeffrey's smile was tight, a predator expecting a pat on the head from the lion. He didn't notice that Mark's eyes weren't on him. They were fixed on Sarah, and they held a depth of sorrow that was terrifyingly out of place on the face of a corporate shark. Mark took a step forward, entering the cramped, fluorescent-lit space of the service hallway. The smell of dish soap and old grease was a sharp contrast to the lavender and leather scent of the dining room, but Mark didn't seem to notice. "Riffraff," Mark repeated the word slowly, tasting the bile in it. The manager blinked, his smile faltering slightly. Excuse me, sir." The man was filthy. He smelled of smoke and sweat. He was clearly a vagrant trying to... He smelled of smoke, Mark interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet, because he spent the last 14 hours inside the Anderson Logistics Distribution Center on 35th Street. The building that houses the livelihood of 300 employees, the silence that descended on the hallway was absolute. Sarah Thompson looked up, her breath hitching in her throat. Jeffrey Lewis went from a flush of anger to a ghostly, sickly white. The connection snapped into place for everyone in the room. The soot wasn't dirt. It was the debris of Mark Anderson's own empire, carried on the shoulders of the man who had fought to save it. Mark continued, his gaze pinning Jeffrey to the wall. That man is David Miller. He is a captain with the Chicago Fire Department. He is also the father-in-law of my sister, Elizabeth Jones. Mark took another step, closing the distance until he was towering over the manager. And while I sat there, sipping scotch and worrying about profit margins, it was this young woman, this liability, as you called her, who did the job that every single one of us failed to do. She saw a human being in distress. Jeffrey opened his mouth to stammer an excuse, his hands fluttering nervously. "Sir? I didn't know. I was just trying to protect the brand." Mark laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. "The brand is dead, Jeffrey. You killed it the moment you decided that a $50 tie was worth more than a man's dignity. You don't protect my brand." Mark reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping a single button before holding it up. "You're fired. Effective immediately. Get your things and leave." As Jeffrey slunk away, stripped of his authority and his arrogance, shrinking under the gaze of the kitchen staff who were now openly staring, Mark turned his attention to Sarah. The shift in his demeanor was jarring. The cold fury evaporated, replaced by a tentative, almost awkward gentleness. Sarah was trembling, the adrenaline of the firing colliding with the shock of the intervention. She clutched her apron, unsure if she was still employed or if this was just a different kind of reprimand. "Sarah," Mark said softly, using her name for the first time, "I owe you an apology. A profound one. I watched what happened in the foyer, and I did nothing." Sarah shook her head, finding her voice. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Anderson. He looked like my dad." Mark Lamidor really looked at her, noticing the fraying hem of her uniform and the deep, dark circles under her eyes. "You gave him $50, Mark stated. Not as a question, but as a fact he was trying to process. "And the 20 for the water, I saw the transaction." Sarah Thompson looked down at her worn sneakers. The truth was too heavy to hide anymore. "It was for Jacob Walker," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My little brother. He has severe asthma and a lung complication. The pharmacy raised the price on his maintenance inhaler again. That money, that was the copay for tomorrow morning. I don't know why I gave it away. It was stupid." The confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. She had traded her brother's breath for a stranger's comfort. Tears spilled over again, hot and fast. Mark felt a tightening in his own chest, a physical pang of guilt that was sharper than any business loss. He realized then that the wealth in the room wasn't in his bank account. It was standing right in front of him, shivering in a wet waitress uniform. He didn't reach for his checkbook. That would be too easy, too transactional. Instead, he lifted his phone again. "1 hour, Mark murmured, checking the time. "It's been about an hour since David Miller walked out those doors?" Sarah asked, wiping her eyes, confused. Mark didn't answer immediately. He dialed the number and put it on speakerphone, holding it out between them. The ringback tone purred twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Dr. Richard Davis here, Mark. Is everything all right?" Sarah gasped. Dr. Davis was the head of pulmonology at the city's research hospital, a name she had seen on paperwork she could never afford to sign. "Dr. Davis," Mark said, his voice steady. "I need a favor. I'm sending a car to pick up a young boy named Jacob Walker. I want him admitted to your private wing immediately." There was a pause on the line. The doctor asked. Mark looked at Sarah, who had covered her mouth with her hands to stifle a sob. "He's family," Mark said firmly. "Bill everything to the Anderson Foundation." He hung up the phone and looked at Sarah. "You won't need to buy inhalers anymore. Sarah Thompson." Sarah's knees finally gave out, and she sank onto a stack of milk crates, weeping uncontrollably. It wasn't the polite crying of the dining room. It was the heaving, messy release of a burden being lifted after years of carrying it alone. Mark Anderson knelt, Dean ruining his suit trousers on the greasy floor without a second thought. placed a hand on her shoulder. "You saved my family tonight, Sarah," he said quietly. But he wasn't finished. "Also," he added, a small, genuine smile touching his lips, "I'm going to need a new manager for this place. Someone who understands that hospitality isn't about exclusion, but about care." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious. I'm just a waitress." "I don't need a degree," Mark countered. "I have 1,000 MBAs working for me, and not one of them has half the character you showed in that lobby. I need a human being." 3 months later, the neon sign of the Velvet Grill had been replaced. It now read The Hearth, a name chosen to signify warmth and welcome. Inside, the stuffy atmosphere of exclusion was gone, replaced by a vibrant, bustling energy where suits mingled with blue-collar workers. Sarah Thompson stood at the podium, looking out over the room she now managed. She wore a tailored blazer, but kept a small pin on her lapel, a tiny silver fireman's helmet, a gift from David Miller. In the corner booth, the same one where the vagrant had been kicked out, sat David and Jacob. The little boy was laughing, breathing clearly and deeply, devouring a burger while David le mostraba fotos del camión de bomberos. Mark Anderson sat with them, no longer the isolated king on a throne, but a part of the community. He caught Sarah's eye from across the room and raised his glass in a silent toast. It wasn't champagne, it was just ice water. A simple, clear reminder of the night the rain washed away the pretenses and revealed the gold hidden underneath. Life often tests us in the most unexpected ways, presenting us with choices that seem impossible. Sarah Thompson chose kindness when she had every reason to choose survival, and in doing so, she didn't just save a stranger. She rewrote her own destiny. We often think that heroes are the ones with the power, the money, or the titles, but tonight we learned that true heroism is often quiet. Dressed in a tired uniform, holding a glass of water with trembling hands, it's a reminder that no act of love is ever wasted, and that sometimes the bread you cast upon the waters comes back to you as a feast. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of empathy, please consider joining our community by hitting that subscribe button. We are building a space here for stories that matter, for narratives that heal. I would love to know where you are joining us from today. Leave the name of your city in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And tell me, did you like the video? What was the most important lesson you took away from Sarah and Mark's journey? Your insights make this community stronger. Thank you for watching, and until the next story, keep your heart open.